Paul comes to the second issue that the Corinthians wrote to him about in this passage that we're going to read today. In the first part of this chapter, he's dealing with questions that are especially relevant to those who are married. But in the second part of the chapter, he's writing in respect of those who have never been married. That's why he refers to virgins in verse 25. Now, while the question at the start of the chapter may have been whether married Christians must become celibate, the question now is whether the unmarried must remain celibate. So we'll start to read about this in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, and we're going to read verses 25 to 28. Now concerning virgins, I have no commandment of the Lord, yet I give my judgment as one that hath obtained mercy of the Lord to be faithful. I suppose therefore that this is good for the present distress. I say that it is good for a man so to be. Art thou bound unto a wife? Seek not to be loosed. Art thou loosed from a wife? Seek not a wife. But and if thou marry, thou hast not sinned. And if a virgin marry, she hath not sinned. Nevertheless, such shall have trouble in the flesh, but I spare you. Paul once again indicates that he's dealing with a subject about which the Lord Jesus gave no specific teaching. That's what he means when he writes, I have no commandment of the Lord in verse 25. It's just the same as earlier in the chapter where he noted, to the rest speak I, not the Lord, in verse 12. The Lord did not deal specifically with this particular issue. However, Paul also tells us that he is one that hath obtained mercy of the Lord to be faithful in verse 25 again. What he has written can be relied upon because he is trustworthy in terms of his judgment on these matters. Now, in the second part of the chapter, Paul approaches the subject from the point of view of serving the Lord, given that the responsibilities of marriage can have a real impact on our commitments. For example, he indicates that those who marry, such shall have trouble in the flesh, verse 28. And he wants them to avoid that. I would have you without carefulness, he says in verse 32. Now his objective is that ye may attend upon the Lord without distraction in verse 35. So Paul's experience is that serving the Lord is easier if you're unmarried, as he was, of course. So in dealing with this issue, Paul's judgment is couched in these words. I suppose therefore that this is good for the present distress, verse 26. It is Paul's view that a good course of action is that a person remains as they are. So to be in verse 26 carries the force of to be as he is in the American Standard Version, or to remain as he is, as the English Standard Version says. Whether married or unmarried, stay as you are. Now we'll see that in the next verse. Where Paul writes, art thou bound to a wife in verse 27, he's referring to people who are married, and he explicitly instructs them, seek not to be loosed in the same verse. In other words, in this situation, don't seek to end it by separation or divorce. When he writes, art thou loosed from a wife in the same verse, he's referring to people without a wife for whatever reason, and he advises, seek not a wife in the same verse. Don't be anxious to change your marital status. But that advice comes with a caveat. If thou marry, thou hast not sinned in verse 28. Now this is obviously not a carte blanche statement, but rather one in principle. If a believer marries an unbeliever, it is a sin. Paul means that if an unmarried person has the option of marriage, they wouldn't sin if they did marry in keeping with scriptural teaching. For example, Matthew chapter 5 or Matthew chapter 19. But he does indicate that that is not without its pressures. When he writes, but I spare you in verse 28, he really means I would spare you that, or I wouldn't want you to have those troubles. You can see why he advises, seek not a wife.